before we begin. There's some water, coffee. Help yourself. We're going to begin in a minute.
That's great. That's terrific. I think he's it's fantastic. He's been doing a lot. He's teaching these classes. Somehow his classes took off. Good. I think somebody somebody's going to be holding up the "You've run out of time" bag, right? Yeah. Do you guys have to buy those? Or
Hannah made those.
Hannah made them.
Hannah's been looking forward to see what it looks like, or maybe not.
Oh, you will see. You will love it. You will.
I know the first minute it was a 5-minute, 2-minute, and then we just wanted to pull about halfway.
Yeah.
Right. But they seem to be there multiple times where like maybe it was 2 minutes. You know what? It's nothing like I gave it to one in the Staples Center in LA. Oh wow, you did. And they have like a oh my god. Oh my god. So it starts out
Green, yellow, red.
but then it's yellow, of course. You know, I mean it's just the most honestly, that was the worst experience ever.
Hello. I think we're going to begin the afternoon panel now. If everyone can grab a seat. I'm just going to introduce everyone. Should I just go? Wait till people are seated. Clap your hands once and hear my voice. Dude, Rex looks so much healthier All right. I'm super excited from what we've heard so far at the panels. It's been so wonderful. Ben and I, we're truly amazed with the energy you have all brought today. We've had some great panels and great discussions, and honestly wish we could have hour-long lectures from each of you, or more, to glean what you have. So to round out our day, we wanted to connect our discussion to larger issues of the world. We hope that this next panel will help guide us toward a more compassionate future. To start, Shelley Hornstein is professor of architectural history and visual culture at York University in Toronto. Her most recent book is titled Losing Sight: Architecture, Memory, and Place, but her current work is called Sightseeing: Monumental Itineraries and Architectural Tourism. Next, James Wescoat is an Aga Khan Professor of Landscape Architecture and Geography at MIT and directs the Norman B. Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. He is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Francis Oda is the chairman of Group 70, an architecture firm in Hawaii. He is a fellow of the AIA and also serves as a pastor for New Life Church in Honolulu. Munjed Murad is a doctoral student at the Divinity School here at Harvard, whose research is on environmental philosophies in world religions. And finally, Kyle Dugdale, our moderator, who is a graduate of the GSD but is on faculty at Yale. His first book, published in 2016, is titled Babel's Present. Again, you can read more about each of these panelists on our website, but for now, please welcome Shelley Hornstein.
Hi. Well, we're equally amazed with you guys for organizing this. Thank you so much. It's brought an enormous amount of inspiration to me today, so I'll be thinking about it for quite some time. Anyway, I just thought I'd, while I was walking my dog this week, I was listening to the podcast Unorthodox that I was just mentioning. I don't know if you've ever listened to it. It's an irreverent podcast for Jews and non-Jews alike that just happened to mention the team or the podcast hosts who are East Coast based went out to LA and held one of the episodes in this synagogue in LA. And they were amazed with the structure, the architecture of the synagogue itself, which happened to have been apparently organized around a courtyard, and the courtyard itself had these palm trees, and of course it was glorious. And one of the people who is a co-anchor of the show said, I'm quoting, "It's how you build synagogues when you're happy." So I thought I'd use that. It was a perfect entree into what I want to say, because the story is told. Let me put it on the first slide. Maybe. There we go. Thank you. The story is told by Rabbi Yankel Tauber that two architects were designing a competition for the homes for the new millennium, as it was called. And the first explains, according to Rabbi Tauber, that his design may seem revolutionary because we've drifted away, he said, from the home's initial primal function. The kitchen had moved to the back of the house from the center. So he was trying to move it back to the center of the house. It shrunk in size originally, he was claiming, sometimes to minuscule proportions. The dining table itself devolved into an undersized kitchen table and then to a small countertop even, at which one perches to grab a bite. My design, said this architect, represents the endeavor to recapture the original purpose of the home, where the kitchen is central, to shelter and to nourish its inhabitants. Now, the second architect, explains Rabbi Tauber, moved the kitchen and other surface areas out into the courtyard, out of the house. The building's core was an intimate room, instead furnished with bookshelves bearing a collection of ancient and modern volumes, according to this architect. It was a space for people to pursue intellectual study, listen to heart-stirring music, he said, and engage in soul-enriching dialogue. As you can see, the second architect began, I have taken the very opposite approach to my esteemed colleague. The home should cater to our visceral needs, but is that all it is? Is that all we are? He continued, bodies that eat. To me, he said, the primary function of a home is to house and facilitate our spiritual self, the self that thinks and feels, the self that gains and imparts knowledge and wisdom, the self that thrives on receiving and sharing joy. Happiness. This passage then, for me, or this story, opens up a conversation with at least two threads that I'd like to pursue. The importance of place, of course, in architectural space. This might sound like a bit of a rewind from Barbara's talk in the morning. And architectural space is specifically for my purposes within a Jewish tradition. And the commandment, the second thread, the commandment to remember, and by corollary, the prohibition to forget in the Hebrew Bible. So place and memory. And to this end, I want to tie into those concepts, which you see on the screen here, which is, I guess we could call the title of my talk, an architecture of the heart. In other words, the heart as an organ in the body, but metaphorically, of course, what it means to emote or to pull at the heartstrings for an architecture to come into form, to at least take shape, that happy architecture perhaps, as well as at the same time, a rejection or a denial of place, the vacuous qualities of a place that renders it a site of contemplation. What might it mean according to biblical teachings? What do I mean by an architecture of the heart? Will they not instruct you, as you can see here, and utter words out of their heart? For heart in Jewish texts, and I am by no means a scholar on the topic, so I appreciate input afterwards, means many things. Wisdom, for example. Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom, in the Psalms. Or that in counting the days we have on earth, we grow wiser in how to use them, and where heart and wisdom are one. Or where longing is a function of the heart, expressed in yet other examples in Judaism. The concept of generosity, for example, is expressed, but rooted more importantly in the function of the heart. Men and women, I'm quoting, men and women whose hearts moved them brought gifts to help construct the Mishkan, or the tabernacle. So a heart full of emoting qualities in tandem with generosity, wisdom, and even bravery, again from the Psalms. So when architecture evolved into I guess we could say, a teachable discipline within its own educational system, eventually in the Beaux-Arts and all that, I don't have to educate most of you in the room here for sure, beginning with the Académie Royale d'Architecture founded by Colbert in 1671, it eventually followed rationalist claims in a kind of vociferous opposition to religious belief structures, as we know. After all, architecture involved mathematics and reason, but at the same time, creativity, wisdom, generosity, matters of the heart. And the split between science, engineering, and architecture made it all too plain to see that belief, creativity, the sensorial, and the ineffable somehow were still situated in the work, and that the design process itself, the creative energy that allowed for design to develop and progress, came out of something else, something intangible, something ineffable. We could indeed, of course, afterwards perhaps have a robust discussion about the eventual split between engineering and architecture, because prior to that, as has been mentioned here today, for example, we have these wondrous examples of the holistic nature of architecture and engineering and science and everything else in the pyramids and in, Imhotep and Leonardo even later and so on. But as with all the disciplines subject to the philosophies of positivism, rationalism, and empiricism, science would trump religion and metaphysics. Auguste Comte believed that there was a theological stage of development crucial to begin with, and that this eventually would lead to a metaphysical explanation. However, ultimately, both these stages, according to him, would end with the most important, the scientific, the provable, the tangible evidence. Now, I've had a curiosity, excuse me, I've had a curiosity about what it is that connects us to this earth physically, materially. Let me put it, excuse me, another way. If indeed we are to aspire to a greater place where materiality is insignificant and we come to realize the value of life, then why is it that we are also physically present and have built buildings and relish in material objects? So there's a series of passages in the Bible that have haunted me forever. And I have to admit that they began to haunt me when I was actually very bored in synagogue one day and picked up the book and started to flip through it and came across these passages. And since then, it's haunted me. So keep in mind about the measurement of the cubit, which I'm sure most of you know all about. And essentially, it's that distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. And I'll just cite a passage, and you can see bits of it on the screen here. When the Talmud, they made upright frames of acacia wood for the tabernacle. Each frame, bear with me for this, it's long, was 10 cubits long and a cubit and a half wide, with 2 projections set parallel to each other. They made all the frames of the tabernacle in this way. They made 20 frames for the south side of the tabernacle and made 40 silver bases to go under them, 2 bases for each frame, 1 under each projection. For the other side, the north side of the tabernacle, they made 20 frames and 40 silver bases, 2 under each frame. They made 6 frames for the far end, that is the west end of the tabernacle, and 2 frames were made for the corners of the tabernacle at the far end. At these 2 corners, the frames were double from the bottom all the way to the top and fitted into a single ring. Both were made alike. So there were 8 frames and 16 silver bases, 2 under each frame. I'm only giving you a snippet, but it goes on and on like this. Incredible architectural specs. So when the Talmud dictates architectural specs for how to build the tabernacle with precisions that seem to, in a way, forestall creativity, I find I'm asking myself, why? Why the insistence on the physical measurements and materials? Why the determination to ensure its limits? excuse me, to ensure its limits. Why is the temple, in spite of the restrictions, on measurements, a structure, temporary at that, nomadic at best, built anywhere and not in one place, but meant for portability, as Barbara mentioned this morning, and transportability to other sites? Why does it serve to underscore at once the notion of place as all important, and yet the notion of place as immaterial altogether? The tabernacle, once built, is to serve as a fixed, nomadic place. This is something I find poetic, frustrating, and profound. So coincident with the notion of fixity is the notion of mobility. Place and things matter. Place and things don't matter at all. What remains as the connector between them? Now, the commandment to remember wakes us up to realizing the worth and credibility of our thoughts, emotions, and heart, and that its value is not to be discounted or undone by how history has decided it will be recorded. Generosity, bravery, creativity, the ineffable qualities I mentioned earlier are embedded in the body, in the heart that is moored, that is material. So those two things coming together. Other examples of architecture situated between fixity and fluidity, we could say, are, and again, this is the rewind, the eruv, which had been mentioned earlier. Here I'm showing an image of Sophie Cals. She's a French artist some of you may know about, who had done a fabulous project on the eruv in 1999 that has circulated around the globe in many different versions. But in any case, I'm showing you the eruv, which is that rabbinic prohibition against carrying objects, the container or the demarcation of a boundary because of the rabbinic prohibition against carrying objects outside of one's home on the Sabbath. So observant Jews, as we heard today, erect an eruv, a boundary made of walls or wires or neutral barriers that establish a collective property, transforming public to private space through which one can move as if within one's home. In Sophie Cals' exhibition, by the way, which was a series of photographs, she took and conducted interviews with Israelis and Palestinians. It entered into a whole other contemporary version of the project, asking each of the people she was interviewing to discuss the notion of public and private space. So again, with this type of architectural construct, which is almost conceptual, only a tiny line, as you can see on the left, almost a line in the sand, is what demarcates and nothing more. It can encompass any zone and is free to be reconsidered, in that sense, reconstructed. Margaret Olin, in her piece on minimalist urban poetics of the eruv, as she called her piece, tells us that the eruv construction is based on what she calls a small vocabulary, primarily to camouflage its efforts to keep the eruv from intruding in the urban setting. Comprised mainly of bricolage materials, wires, and utility poles found in the sites. We saw the sukkah today, which is another form of temporary fixed construction. And we have the chuppah, which I'm mentioning here, or the bridal canopy, which serves as a third example of temporary architecture, constructed of a covering or protection, which has various contested meanings, but generally it is a cloth or talit spread over 4 poles, where the fastening of the cloth to the poles must be at the top, indicating a legal separation from the public domain into the groom's private home. Each of these symbolic architectural temporary constructions concurrently negate and affirm place. In the Talmud, as some scholars point out, God belongs in this world, but the world is not God's place, thus a paradox. And to wit, this is in opposition to the concept of idolatry, where an idol is cast, whereas, of course, in Judaism, God casts out idols. And instead, and this is important for the tabernacle per se, God is located in the vacant space in the tabernacle between the cherubs. So to conclude, what does all this mean? Let me just give two quick comments. First is that notion of the post-human turn, and I note that Rosie Bradotti is coming here to speak in a couple of days, so for those who can make it, I encourage you to attend. She is talking lately in her latest book, that was 2 minutes? Okay. Of the post-secular turn in religion. I'll wrap it up in 2 seconds. And it's actually Habermas who signals the one-dimensionality of how we have seen the secular, or how we have seen secularity and modernity. Post-secular, he says, describes the ruptures in the taken-for-granted structure of secularization that today is being called into question. And so to return to the happy place of architecture that I began with, or the contrast in architectural theories between where the kitchen should or should not be placed within the home, we might look to considering how what we might call God or God's place in between the cherubs, that je ne sais quoi metaphysical connection within the heart, or the heart as emoting central, as spiritual central, really, to consider the fragility, the temporality of place, the recognition of the ineffable qualities of the emoting heart, and the fleeting nature of what architecture as built material form actually means. Bezalel, who was the architect of the tabernacle, his construction of it was a negation of place through a fully realized muscularity of presence and built form. The constructed place that is as ephemeral as it is tangible ensures that we are considering at all moments the wonder of life, the connection of memory to history, of the fleeting to the documented, and of our being to its absolute lightness. Thank you.
James.
Thanks very much to the organizers for including me in this. And I'd like to try to build on some of the things that Professor Hornstein was saying with respect to the role of heart in this construction of a compassionate environment and what that might entail, and use the example of garden history and philosophy in South Asia, and particularly in Pakistan, where I've been working. This presentation comes out of some of the teaching that I do on garden history, water conserving design, and disaster resilient design at MIT. And the title takes its inspiration from 3 types of verses in the Quran that refer to gardens. So there's a small number of verses that refer to the Garden of Eden. So with close biblical parallels. By far the largest number of verses refer to the paradise gardens that await those who have had faith and done good works at the time of the resurrection. And then there are a third set of verses that deal with the gardens of this world, which are much more mixed. Gardens as signs of the beneficence of Allah for those who have the eyes to see and perceive them. But then also gardens as warnings, gardens that were built perhaps sometimes with some sorts of arrogance, hubris that then when destroyed should come as no surprise. So the irrigated gardens of this world are going to be part of the presentation that I have for the studies that we've done of Islamic gardens in the Indo-Islamic context, but also in relationship to these other ideals of Eden and Jannah, paradise. It's just this one story of many that I might have shared, but I thought, let me just start with one. Exactly 30 years ago, when working in Lahore, Pakistan on 2 projects. One of them was a study that the Smithsonian Institution supported on Mughal gardens, which is a branch of Islamic garden design in India and Pakistan, 16th and 17th, 18th centuries. And that was in collaboration with architecture colleagues at the University of Engineering and Technology in Lahore. But concurrently, parallel with that, I had another research project on the potential effects of global climate change in the Indus River Basin in Pakistan. And that project involved whole teams of engineers and scientists. We had historians and archaeologists working together to try to link together the global climate models with the river basin models, flood hazards models, and then what the insights that historians of the region could offer and archaeologists on long-term processes of sustainability and resilience. So these projects were going full steam in parallel with one another. And I had two mentors, Gilbert White and Elise Boulding, who are part of leaders in a Friends meeting that I was part of, Quaker meeting in Colorado at that time. And they are kind of really the kind of epitome in my experience of having a wisdom that I found enormously valuable, and have written about the qualities of wisdom in their work, this ideal of hikmah and of the ways in which in Old Testament or biblical traditions it's so richly developed, but then comparatively and in the fields of even educational psychology, this is enormously important. And we've heard it various times from morning up through the moment about concepts of wisdom. And the role it plays in design, I think, is extremely important. And at MIT, we'll have discussions in design studios as what would constitute a wise approach to design. It's part of the mission statement of the Institute that we seek to cultivate in every member of the MIT community, the ability to act wisely, effectively, and creatively to address the problems of humankind and the environment. And so I said, I see the creativity, I see the efficacy. Where is the wisdom in the work that we do? And then we try to discuss that, but it's at a very early stage relative to these other aspects of creativity, innovation, and productivity, and so on. But it's extremely important in my mind. And these two mentors asked me, well, what are you learning in Pakistan? And I had to say, well, on the garden side, they're kind of learning that the places that are the famous historic gardens of Lahore, Shalimar Bagh, and so many other monumental gardens of the Mughal Empire, they have many of the qualities of the form of gardens as described in the Quran. But their historical context is quite problematic and raises all kinds of questions about the motivations and context of garden construction that lead me to think that they're not that closely related to the connotation of gardens in the Quran. However, there are other places in Lahore that I've been which have many of the meanings and kind of virtues of gardens that we read about in the Quran, but they don't have the form or name. So it's a really interesting relationship between form and meaning and places that one will start to study in some historical depth. On the water resources side, what we're finding is we have an unprecedented ability to study the potential effects of climate change in the Indus River Basin in Pakistan. It's even more informative than the studies that we can do in the United States. We don't have the models in the US that we have for the Indus River Basin. So and the team that was going together was going, in all kinds of creative way with linked models and multidisciplinary types of collaboration that weren't happening elsewhere. But during the course of these studies, at least one local, is actually a clerk. He said, why are you doing all of this sophisticated work? You seem to be neglecting the most obvious aspect of this problem of global climate change, which is that we're not living as we should. And, if we were only to live in ways that were kind of we know to be right and virtuous, then the reliance on God and the types of outcomes that we might hope for would be realized. So it took the clerk's passage seriously and put it into our published results to say this is a fourth conceptual approaches. We have all the modeling approaches, we have historical types of approaches, critical water problems approach. We also have this category that the team we called Muslim political reconstruction, the idea that it would be necessary and possible to take that kind of approach to climate adaptation, as well as the more scientific types of approaches. Well, then Gilbert and Lee said, well, what's the relationship between these two projects? One on garden history, the other on climate change. Is there something they might share? And that said, well, let me say, yes, let me, there could be, let me try. And the idea was to say, to go from the engineering approach to the Indus River Basin and to say, what if we were to think of this very large, enormous irrigated landscape as a garden? And to think about the ideas and ideals of the garden as perhaps being inspiring for new approaches to water resources management, that somehow all of the scientific and engineering expertise and management approaches that we're bringing just weren't sufficient or adequate to mitigate the risks and concerns that we have. So let's consider this. And thinking like a designer, I said, okay, fine, we'll start with making a section and draw a section of the basin from the headwaters down through the plains into the deltaic region to the left. And then we'll do a search. We're going to search for the places that would have this both form and meaning, but most importantly, the meaning and spirit of gardens as we've kind of studied and come to understand them. And the collaboration here is primarily with a team of some architects, but also engineers at the Lahore University of Management Sciences who became enthusiastic about it too. As we started to look, and as we did, starting at the upper basin, found this unbelievable example of kitchen gardens that just exquisite and beautiful in profound ways, that then scaled up to the level of the irrigated valleys. This is in the upper Karakoram Hindu Kush range, some of the tallest mountains of the world. And I think Louis Kahn was mentioned earlier in the day, and I said, okay, he's got nothing on this water treatment plant up in the valley of Gilgit-Baltistan. Then coming, we said, well, Kashmir is also known not just for its famous gardens on the left-hand side, but also for the vernacular floating gardens. It's been deemed and called a regional garden, but it's also a place of great strife. And so this really led us to try to think, how do we think about this, I call it garden model or metaphor, in contexts where there's so much human suffering. And so we had a number of things. We had a Colorado Kashmir seminar subtitled Peace Building in Mountain Environments, a 3 Shalimar Bogs conference that brought colleagues from the Shalimar garden context in Delhi together with those from Kashmir and Srinagar and there's a 3rd Shalimar Bog in Lahore, and said, let's bring over all of these friends to Illinois and have some sharing of ideas about what might be possible through the heritage of gardens, the philosophy of gardens that would contribute to a multi-track diplomacy type of work. But I think what I've taken away from the study in the Kashmir context is that in design schools, we really are have a terrible flaw in the timescales of the work. We have a semester type of time frame for problems that might require decades or generations to address. And similarly, in the research fields, we have 3 to 5 year types of research funding for problems that will entail decades or generations. And so I think if we incorporate these longer timescales, and they apply to climate change types of studies as well as those of, call them social conflict, maybe we get more realism in the design studios that we offer. Well, coming down onto the plains, we have the largest contiguously irrigated region of the world, and are starting to ask, how can that landscape be considered as a garden as compared with an agribusiness? Down in the lower basin, Karachi, we have examples of communities reconstructing and doing all kinds of inspiring work in large-scale low-income settlements that we said these are gardens also in the connotative sense of the term. And it's kind of trying to discern out from these examples, as well as the literature and cultural heritage of the region. And this is what resonated with some of Shelley's points earlier on the philosophy of the heart, some of the key components, and this is a work in progress, is certainly that of care. And as compared with the formal approaches to water resources management, none of these are featured. But in the garden tradition, care is fundamental. The dignity of cultivators and of cultivation, also the balance, mizan, harmony, that's certainly there in Islamic philosophy, gratitude and patience, good works, of course, beauty, as we've mentioned it in the fullest sense of the term, and all of these, all of the above are signs when you see them in this world, and inspiring and replicable and scalable to address these large problems that we have. Conclude with this last slide to mention that the colleagues in the Lahore University of Management, and these are electrical engineers of all people, saying, oh yeah, this idea resonates. Let's try to take the things that we're doing with sensor systems and robotics and data analytics and kind of weave them together with the cultural and spiritual traditions that we have and share both within Pakistan, but then with our neighbors in the countries around us, that we have, lots of shared traditions with Punjab and Kashmir and Afghanistan, in which we might be able to communicate in new ways, better ways than we have in the past. I thought I'd share this example as some of what could be construed as the movement towards thinking about environment in compassionate terms, in which religions, one's own and that of others, can converge in ways that can be inspired and inspiring. Thanks very much.
Just go right, left. Yep, it should work. Right. Just this. Yeah, good.
I'm going to start with a story. Aloha, everyone. Very good. It began one day when I was driving to work, and I had just become a Christian, my wife and I. Very unlikely couple. We were in our early 30s, as far away from any kind of religious belief as you might imagine. But that's another story. And so the guy who took us to church told us, look, if you're going to become Christians, go all in, okay? Read the Bible, go to church, pray, and tithe. We didn't even know what tithing meant. But we did it all. Tithing is giving 10% of your gross income to the church. And that very morning, I had read this passage. Okay, bring the whole tithe to the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. It says, test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the gates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that will not be enough room to store it. My problem was not literally about money. It was about whether I could take the word of God to be true. You know, it had been written by so many different people over eons of time in multiple languages and translated down to where I could read it in English. And it just did not seem intellectually such a great idea to take it really as truth. So I was grappling with this. And at that moment, as I'm driving, thinking about this, can I take the Bible literally? Can I take this kind of passage literally? Because we had enough, but this meant it would be poured out, that we couldn't even contain it. Three thoughts came to my mind. First, that in fact, it would occur because we would have large projects. At that time, we were a very small firm of about 7 people. And the second thought that came to my mind was that we would be prepared to do it And third was a specific number. That number was many times larger, multiple times larger than any other project we had ever done. So I get to the office. I'm a new convert, right? So I'm zealous. So I call the other 6 people to the conference room and I tell them, God just spoke to me. And I tell them exactly what God told me, and I can see their eyes getting big. I can read their minds. Francis has totally flipped out. Maybe I should get a job at another office. Well, that Friday, this was a Monday. That Friday, 3 guys walk into the office without an appointment. And one was a guy named Don Graham. And any of you who have been to Honolulu, you know the Ala Moana Shopping Center. He's the guy that developed the Ala Moana Shopping Center, sort of the dean of developers in Hawaii. So they sit there and talk to me about doing a hotel. The catch-22 in a hotel is you don't get to do hotels unless you've done a hotel before. And here we are, this small little firm. So I'm not taking them seriously. And as most of you will find out, there's a lot of talk about buildings that never, ever come to pass because it takes so much money, so much effort, all that. So I'm not taking them too seriously until they say the budget of the hotel is this exact number that God gave me. And I must tell you, at that moment, it was so unexpected, I actually felt faint. But I pulled together the hundreds of years of Japanese ancestry that I had. I had to try to compose myself, And I said, oh, that's interesting, And so they gave me the rest of the story. And then they left. And I called the whole firm in and told them what had happened. Now, the catch was, in 7 weeks, we had to have our design into Marriott headquarters. 7 weeks. Now, this is pre-computer. All our drawings of that sort, presentation drawings in those days, and some of you will remember, were ink on vellum. And so, the very next morning, we have a charrette, but that night, God literally gave me the design. And a 720-room hotel is like a little city. It has all kinds of things, back of house things, multiple restaurants, things like that. Well, now, just to give you a context too, I was in my mid-30s. Most of the people in our firm were in the late 20s. So we're a very young firm. No big project experience. 7 weeks later, though, we got this thing in, and I'm sitting in a conference room about twice the size of this room with the largest conference table I've ever seen. Every seat is taken, and every seat along the wall is taken, and there is Bill Marriott Jr. at the head of the table. And there's this tall guy, he stands up, and his name was Jack, and he says, I don't understand what Mr. Oda is doing here because I'm the head of the ANC section, Architecture Construction. He says, I have 210 people in my division, and I'm thinking, well, we got 7. And he says, and we have designed every Marriott hotel. And he says, our name is on the wall. And I'm wondering to myself, really, why am I here? That moment, God tells me, I told you you would be here. I gave you that number. Bill Marriott Jr. closes the book, our presentation, and says, ladies and gentlemen, I like this, we're going to do it. Well, that began our international practice at that point. Now, this became the first resort Marriott hotel in the world. They had never done a resort hotel. It was all airport hotels, business hotels, motels. Imagine the largest project we had done to that date was like a big house. And overnight, we have to do something like this. This design now is over close to 40 years old. It became the most productive, profitable Marriott hotel in their entire chain for 10 years. But the key is that I learned 3 things that morning, because this is not my design, this is God's design. I mean, I knew nothing about hotels except, how to pay the check with my credit card. First, he does speak to us in dreams and visions. Number 1. Number 2, that he cares about our work, like architecture, any kind of work, not just his church. And 3, he is the source of design inspiration. Now, up to that time, my thought, and this is what I learned in school, was that somehow design inspiration was inside of me, and I had to pull it out. Pat and I were very, very successful when we had our practice for a number of years in Berkeley. We won all kinds of awards, got published. Pretty much everything we did got published. We won the National AIA Honor Award for one of our projects. I was 27 years old. He was 37 years old, or something like that. We're still young guys. But it was taking a toll on me, because I thought I had this theory, I had to dream it before I could do it. And I go through this 2-week period of pretty much isolating myself, not even talking to my wife very much, not talking to anybody, until I could dream it, draw it, and it would then be recognized. Of course, Pat and I would be talking about it. The problem is I had a pre-ulcer condition. My hair was turning white. I had night blindness. I went to the doctor. He says, whatever you're doing, stop it, because you're killing yourself. Some of you students might really identify with this. But I had no option. I didn't know what else to do, because, we want to do good architecture. Well, after this experience, I realized I am not the source of design creativity. God is the source. What I have to be is a good vessel, a good steward of the design God gives me, and the team and I have to then proceed to make it a reality. Well, I'll show you a couple of more. So this is it along the shoreline. This tiny little firm, but God. This started for me a 45-year daily practice of prayer, envisioning, and journaling. And this is something I did this morning. I do it every morning, and I've done it every morning literally for 45 years. What I've found is doing this, I won't go into detail because I don't have the time, but here's that verse, Hebrews 11:1, that was quoted earlier. Well, in Tahiti, this is the president at that time. There was a huge social problem. One was economic and political. And so the president of Tahiti decided that there would be an international competition to create essentially a tourism base for Tahiti. Tahiti is a beautiful place. If there's one place more beautiful than Hawaii, hope this is not being recorded, it's Tahiti, But amazingly, there's really no tourism base there. So he sent out an international invitation for competition. We submitted, 87 firms submitted from all over the world. It came down to 3. And one was this mega group from France, organized around a semi-governmental bank with real estate investment, all of that, finance, architecture, engineering, and another mega similar group from China and G70. So it was 2 Goliaths and 1 David, but God. So we submitted, And this had to be done very, very fast. Again, claim no credit for the conceptual design, because all of it came via God's inspiration and vision. This is the area, it's 2/3 the size of Waikiki, and some of you have been to Waikiki. It's based on Polynesian voyaging, which is the core of all Polynesian culture. And so, for example, here's a building honoring that culture and that tradition. And, we're not trying to recreate the past. This is a living culture, so it's reaching to the future. But we also use technology that is traditional. All of these things, coconut trees, for example, came via voyaging. They were not indigenous to the islands there. A symbol of hospitality is the coconut leaf basket. This is a conference center with an equal size parking structure. How do you integrate them? Well, you just throw them into a basket. Each of these came, because of the competition, maybe 3 days. We had 3 days for each of these buildings. Here's another situation where the thing on the left is called stick chart, and it was used by the ancient navigators to look at the stars, the constellations, but also the tides and the wind patterns. Now, imagine they came from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, for example, to find Hawaii, dots in the Pacific, at a time when Europeans were afraid to go to the horizon. Well, this is the marina that's part of our complex. What we did was embedded the stick chart for Tahiti into the facade. So at night, with LED lighting, you see the stick chart against the very same sky that the navigators saw thousands of years ago. Well, the good news was that we won the competition. So at the party in Tahiti announcing this, the president comes up to me and congratulates me. I'm very happy, have a glass of wine in my hand. And he says, but Francis, we don't have the money for this. Our project costs $3 billion. He says, can you raise the money for us? It kind of took the sparkle out of the event somehow. But I figured, look, God got us to this point. He had us win the competition. What's the difference between 3 million, 30 million, 300 million, 3 billion? So we actually raised the money. And we'll proceed with the project in the future. But one thing that I have found is that the projects themselves are simply vehicles for God's larger purpose. And for us, it means ending systemic poverty, addressing systemic corruption, which is rather universal, honoring the culture by working from within the culture rather than in this colonial way, just sort of trying to impose some external culture over the cultures we're working with, find the solutions from within the culture, and then finally bless the land. Things of sustainability that and we run across a lot of land that has been desecrated. And not only physically desecrated, but spiritually desecrated. One of the things about the program that we have is that, for example, when you you address systemic poverty, you bring is that 10 or 15? Okay. Well, we have programs of family management, family conflict, all of that. I might be able to go over that later. But it's not about the project. It doesn't end when the project ends and is completed. You have to, once you get into a culture, you have to go all the way to the end. Okay, so we're working with the Navajo in Senegal, in Juarez, the murder capital, and Indonesia, And that's it. Thank you.
It's an honor to speak to you today. I must start off by highlighting something special about this conference. In a context in which it is taboo, in a context in which it is taboo to be religious or to speak about religion, to hold a conference like this is a brave thing. It is really taboo to be religious today, and I hope that this conference helps us to recognize what it is that we lose and helps make the inclusivism of the day more sincere by including those who are systematically and culturally shunned. Thank you to the organizers for your bravery. Now, every civilization has to deal with the relationship between the natural and the artificial. And by the artificial, I mean the man-made. That is, every civilization has to determine what the relationship is between nature on the one hand and what humanity produces on the other. It is clear that the modern mind is in need of revising its relationship with its natural environment. In doing so, we can turn to other civilizations for insight into what a harmonious relationship between what we build and nature can look like. We're certainly not the first to ask this question, and millennia of human wisdom can help us. In this sense, I turn to Islamic architecture with the hope of learning something that could benefit us here and now. I must clarify, however, that similar to Oludamini Ogunaike, who spoke earlier today, I'm not talking about buildings that Muslims build, but rather about buildings that are the product of the traditional Islamic worldview and paradigm. There's an important nuance here, let me explain. Every building is the result of the worldview and paradigm of the architects designing it. That Gund Hall, the building that we're in now, that Gund Hall is shaped the way it is the result of a particular worldview that produced it. Although it might sound surprising, with the colonization of education in the East, most Muslim architects today are trained in modern architecture. And so they design things that are much more like Gund Hall. So they design things that are much more like Gund Hall than Islamic structures such as the Dome of the Rock, the Alhambra, or the Taj Mahal. The result is that they are essentially architects trained in modern Western methods of architecture and who have Muslim names. I'm not presenting on what they build, but I'm not presenting on what they build because what they build is the product of a different kind of architecture. Rather, I'm presenting on structures that are the direct result of a tradition of Islamic architecture built using Islamic architectural principles. Now, buildings interact with the natural environment around them. Fortunately, we have efforts today that reduce the effect of artificial infrastructure on the natural world through renewable energies and other means that try to lessen the impact of buildings on the natural environment. But there are other ways in which a building interacts with its environment. How do natural phenomena perceive and experience a building? I know that this sounds like a strange question, but consider it. Usually when designing a building, an architect takes several stakeholders into account. The clients who are paying for the building, the people who walk into a building and use the building, those who neighbor the structure. Rarely, as I'm sure all of you know, does one consider the creatures within the immediate natural environment of the building. Rarely do they consider them as a stakeholder. For example, turning to the image of a skyscraper. Every year in the US, between 365 and 988 million birds die out of collision with buildings. The use of transparent glass for a building means that birds often do not notice windows, which are transparent but solid. And so they slam into them, probably breaking their necks and then dying. This is from an actual exhibit that collects birds that hit lit buildings at night and shows them to the world for them to know about this, to increase awareness of. Now, again, that is hundreds of millions of birds every year in the US alone. Of course, there are countless other examples of how other beings who share our spaces are affected by the structures that we build and whose experiences we do not take into consideration when building, such as newly hatched turtles that crawl to cities rather than the sea, being disoriented by the artificial light emanating from the sea and dying out of dehydration or predation. There are many other examples. And just consider that word, skyscraper. Skyscraper, to scrape the sky. As I said, every paradigm offers a unique relationship between the artificial and the natural. And the phenomenon of a skyscraper seems to tell us that our modern day relationship between the artificial and the natural is a violent one. Again, there are different paradigms of dealing with the tension between the natural and what is man-made. In contrast to modern buildings that do not normatively take natural phenomena into account as stakeholders in the building process, Islamic models of architecture take the natural as a model. In a famous report, the Prophet Muhammad said that the earth has been made a mosque for him, which is to say that nature herself is the prototypical mosque. Within the traditional context, the architect sees nature as the result of the first architecture, which is taking God as architect. When designing and building, therefore, the architect conforms to nature and so conforms to a divine architecture. Again, to refer to Oludamni Ogunnaike, yesterday, in a conversation with him, he told me of how so much of Islamic architecture is actually the geometrization of natural phenomena. Moreover, so taking nature as the prototypical mosque. Moreover, that mosques are empty of practically any furniture is meant to highlight the mosque's floor, which is really sacralized earth. In fact, not only is the mosque the geometrization of nature, but as the Islamic philosopher Sayyid Hussein Nasr explains in expounding the principles of Islamic architecture, the mosque is an extension of nature. It's meant to be an extension of nature, some kind of continuity that manifests through human hands, who, in conforming to nature, become natural themselves. Our time is short, and I cannot explain this to you more, but keep this in mind, this image in mind, the mosque as an extension of nature. Now, moving to the next section of this presentation, I find it helpful to focus on a particular structure. There are many different principles that inform the design of this building, the Moroccan Riyadh, which is a traditional North African Islamic home. In light of our shortage of time, I'm only focusing on one or two aspects of the building. A Riyadh is a quadrilateral structure that features a courtyard at its center. That the courtyard is at the center of the structure means that nature is brought into the center of the home, usually in the form of a garden and a body of water, especially a fountain, which signifies a natural spring. In contrast to the many modern hospitals, apartment complexes, office buildings, and malls, which usually do not feature nature anywhere beyond the periphery, that the Riyadh places natural phenomena in the center of the home or of domestic life is to keep human beings in relationship with nature, which perhaps holds a lesson for us today, when in the urban jungle, most people feel alienated and divorced from nature. The The Riyadh also brings in nature in other ways. It draws in and distributes natural light and does so in a very symbolic way. So just this image is that, just imagine like a box and a big empty center. That's also a circle. In protecting the privacy of the residents, there are no windows on the facade, or few windows on the facade. The windows are inward facing the courtyard. What that does is it draws the light from the center and from above, maintaining a symbolism of Islamic metaphysics that God is light, and it is through him and through his revelation that we can see things as they really are. These images of a garden and of light at the center of the Moroccan Riyadh highlight the holistic nature of the Riyadh, which pays attention to metaphysics through its symbolism, to the law through its protection of the privacy of the residents, that the windows are inward facing and not on the outer facade of the structure, protects the privacy of those within it. And also conforms to an ethics with the natural environment by placing natural phenomena at the literal center of the building and in quotidian relationship with human beings. Moreover, that the structure is built to take advantage of natural light makes it harmonious with the natural environment. Of course, at night one would have to use candles, but to have minimized the need for artificial light means that a neighborhood or city of Riyadh does not need to import a great deal of natural resources, but rather utilize what is freely available in the immediate natural environment. The amount of natural resources that it takes to keep New York City running for 50 years destroys countless natural habitats around the world. But a city of structures that harness and distribute the sun's rays for light and the wind for coolness can be maintained for 50,000 years without harming the environment. Now, I must share with you that this is an ingenious design and not some primitive way of building that is not technologically savvy enough to draw a great amount of energy from the earth. The mathematical genius that distributes light and sound in the traditional mosques of Iran means that there is no need for electric lights nor microphones in these mosques, which can host thousands of people. Now, this does not concern most mosques built in the 21st century, which are for the most part modern buildings designed by architects with only modern architectural training and with little to no knowledge of traditional Islamic principles of architecture. Therefore, what they design does not inherit the traditional wisdom of the Islamic world, nor its relationship with nature. My presentation has not considered those buildings which often adopt an Islamic facade, but are built with a modern Western architectural framework. This includes the buildings surrounding the Kaaba in the sacred city of Mecca, which the skyscrapers surrounding it, which Muslims around the world criticize for foregoing a traditional Islamic architectural framework for a modern Western one, blurring the lines between Mecca and Las Vegas. Although the Muslim Big Ben seems to say otherwise, there is a genuine Islamic metaphysics and Islamic epistemology, a genuine Christian metaphysics and epistemology, and so on for many of the world's religions, for all the world's religions that have built structures that have been in harmony with nature for hundreds of years. There is a genuine Islamic architecture that is a kind of genius and that grows from the Islamic metaphysics and epistemology. And the same can be said of a genuine Christian architecture that itself exhibits a genius in and of itself and in relationship with its natural environment. Among the products of these architectural traditions are the historically monumental city of Fez and the Schacht Cathedral, both of which have been commented upon for their architectural wisdom by Titus Burckhardt. Again, this is not to speak only of the past. the idea of a tradition is that it's not a living, it's not a museum and not a museum piece, but a living organ, a living thing. And many architects, and I know for a fact that many architects in Iran learn traditional Islamic architecture. You have in the West itself, you have the Princess School of Traditional Arts and Architecture that are trying to continue this. And now finally, as we have seen in the example of the Moroccan Riyadh, traditional Islamic architecture accounts for the whole drama of life, starting with that which transcends it. It is informed and shaped by metaphysical principles, and so visually reflects them for those with eyes to see and contemplate them. It considers the ethical interaction between human beings and their human neighbors. It also considers the ethical interaction between human beings and their non-human neighbors. Being informed by a holistic view of reality, which I would argue is the purpose of every religious tradition, it presents a whole that accounts for every dimension of a building and every stakeholder, including the non-human. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. First, I wanted to thank GSD and the GSDCF for the invitation and for making the space for discussion of faith within the structure of design. It's an honor to be here. I teach history to architects, among other things. So on some level, I tell stories about our past with the presumption that those stories should have some sort of impact on how we understand our present and on how we might imagine our future. And I've been interested for some time in the relationship between architectural beginnings and ends, between the stories we tell about the origins of architecture or of landscape or of urbanism, and the way they always inform the stories we tell about the ends of architecture or landscape or urbanism. And there's some predictable examples of such myths of origin, right? So for example, Le Corbusier in Toward an Architecture, referring to the so-called primitive man and his architectural impulses. And here, curiously, he supplies an illustration of the Mishkan or tabernacle. Right? The famous one is, of course, Loger's primitive hut, which we all learned about in theory class. And here it's especially clear, as you'll recall, that the story of origins is there to inform ideas about ends. Where we came from should inform where we are going. Who we are, who we really are, should shape what we do. But Loger stands in a long tradition which can be traced back, of course, to who else? Vitruvius, and to his account at the beginning of Book 2 of The Origin of the Dwelling House. The men of old were born like wild beasts, and so on. The story of architecture is there tied in just a few short paragraphs to a whole range of concerns, from the physical to the metaphysical, from the immediate to the eternal, from the need to protect against a hostile environment to the development of language, the possibility of community, the possibility of memory and history, and on to that which is held to distinguish us from other creatures, the ability to walk upright, to lift our eyes and to gaze upon the splendor of the starry firmament. All of these things and more are supposed to shape our understanding of what architecture is all about and of our obligations as architects. But I realized a few years ago that the text of that chapter of Vitruvius bears close comparison to the text of the opening of the book of Genesis. So the sacred text of architecture can be compared directly with another sacred text. Not only is it quite clear that the story of Genesis is there, first of all, to speak to us about our origins as human beings in a way that has everything to do with our ends as human beings, but it's also possible to read Genesis quite specifically as an account of architectural origins. You should try it sometime. It makes a very interesting comparison to Vitruvius. And you can follow that story, of course, all the way from Genesis chapter 1, where we begin with landscape, not architecture, with the Garden of Eden, which we heard about, right, through to Adam's house in paradise, which is famous for not existing because in paradise there is evidently no need for architecture, right, through to the wall that is presumed by the artists to exclude us from Eden after the fall of man. This is where architecture enters the story, right? On to Seth's city, which we can just see on the left-hand side because it was a rather small city. Urbanism as a response to violence, which is also depicted here, fratricidal violence. And on, of course, to Noah's Ark, and then on to my own favorite, the Tower of Babel, and so on. But the figure of the architect who emerges from this story of origins is, of course, first of all, the figure of God. God as creator, God as architect. Deus architectus mundi. Munjed just referred to this also. The God who created and saw that it was good. The reader is invited to make sense of man's constructive impulses through comparison to, and often through contrast to, that primary model of the architect. And this is something that can have, I think, a radical impact on the architectural reader of Genesis, which, by the way, includes not only contemporary architects who happen to be practicing Jews or Christians, but also we have to presume several centuries worth of architectural thinkers in those parts of the world where intellectual formation took place within the context of a familiarity with biblical materials. Now, this, of course, is a vast topic, but I want to pay attention just to one particular implication that has to do with this afternoon's subject, building a compassionate environment. Compassion. There are two readings of this word, which I will refer to as the weaker and the stronger reading. The weaker reading, the everyday reading, means something like pity for the sufferings of others. A compassionate environment. But the environment is not compassionate. Tennyson described it as red in tooth and claw. And this is generally true, I think, whether we're speaking of the natural environment, however you might define that, or of the built environment for sure, or for that matter of the built environment's impact on the natural environment, not to mention the social or the political environment. Oh no, our environment is not compassionate. We're more aware of this today, I think, than we have been for a long time. Everywhere we look, we see not compassion, but violence and fear and suffering. And it's not an aberration. It's in the very nature of things. The environment is not compassionate. It is God who has compassion. And this is acknowledged, I think, by Islam, which speaks of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. It is also visible throughout the Hebrew scriptures, Psalm 103:13, NJPS, and it's identical in the NRSV. As a father has compassion for his children, so the Lord has compassion for those who fear him. And we are to be compassionate because God is compassionate. The motivation for our compassion, in other words, has something to do with our understanding of who we are as children of God. Our understanding of who we are informs our understanding of what we are called to do. Our understanding of our origins informs our understanding of our ends. But there's a stronger reading of that word compassion, tied to the origins of the English word in ecclesiastical Latin. Compassion, suffering with. Compassion, suffering with. And this is where I will turn for a moment quite specifically to Christian doctrine and to an idea that stands at the very center of the story that is told about the relationship between God and his creatures. We're in Lent, a period in the church calendar in the run-up to Easter when Christians pay particular attention to the relationship between the compassion of God and the passion of Christ. The passion of the Son of God, the suffering of the Son of God. God himself, in the person of Jesus, suffers with and for us. This is not just pity for our suffering. This is more than that. Not only does this radically inflect the significance of that origin story, God incarnate, the creator God, takes on the material nature of his creation, but it also shapes in an almost scandalous way the Christian's relationship both to God, the infinite and placeless and eternal Spirit, and to our present finite and material placed reality. This has, I think, massive implications for what we understand to be our ends as designers. I want to close with a story that some of you here may have heard me tell before. Does our shared design culture today have anything quite like an origin story along the lines of Loger or Vitruvius? I would suggest that it does. But it no longer inhabits a text. It inhabits a building, this institution, the School of Architecture. Architecture school as the establishment of an origin story. This right here is our best shot at a shared origin story. And this is true, I think, on a number of different levels, all the way from what it means to be a graduate of Harvard or of Yale, etc., through to the ways in which the core curriculum, that experience, that memory that stands at the very beginning of our formation as designers, is itself designed quite specifically to shape or reshape our habits and our practices and our capacities and our prejudices and our expectations as to what constitutes a valid approach to design. Think about it. Like it or not, your origins inform your ends. It's been a while since I was last in this building. The first time I walked in was on my first day as an MArch-1 student 20 years ago. And the then dean of Harvard Graduate School of Design sat us all down in Piper Auditorium and gave us a talking to. He spoke to us with the intent of shaping our understanding of who we were and of where we should go. And what did he say? He said, "This is it. You're at Harvard now. This is your opportunity. This is the beginning of a journey that will shape the remainder of your life, your identity, your capacities, your opportunities. And how should you approach this?" I quote, "Be selfish. Put aside all those things that will hinder your commitment to architecture. For the space of the next 2 years, for the space of the next 3 years, set aside your other passions, your other interests, your other commitments, your other obligations, your other relationships. This is your opportunity, maybe your only opportunity, to immerse yourself fully in the life of the architect. You have an obligation to yourself and to your own future to live and move and have your being in architecture. Be selfish." Selfishness, of course, is the opposite of compassion. Your passion, in other words, must take priority over your compassion. To be precise, the passion of your approach to architecture must take priority over compassion in your approach to architecture. So I think it's an encouragement that a conversation like this can happen here today, 20 years later. And no doubt there are ways in which today's conversations are insufficient. They're inarticulate, they're halting. But that's because we're not very good at them. And to get better at them, we have to practice. Thank you. Is this on? It is. So I'm taking off my speaker hat and I'm putting on my moderator hat, I think. And it's tough to moderate these things because you feel like you need something with which to hold everything together. And it is hard, I think, to hold these 5 people together, right? I wanted to give all of you an opportunity to respond maybe to one another. I was struck by, I've been struck several times today by a certain discomfort at different moments when people start saying things that I'm not used to hearing and that I'm not quite sure what to do with, right? I don't know if anybody else here has shared those moments of discomfort over the course of the day. So I guess part of my question for all of you, me first, is what do you do with that discomfort? Is it a good discomfort, or is it a result of our ignorance or our failure to know how to where to begin or where to stop, or is it something else? Is that a fair question to start us off?
Can I start? I think one thing I've learned working, especially with Indigenous people who are very, very different, come from a different place, is that you have to accept whatever someone says as their reality. It's not up to you to judge somebody else's reality. It's up to you to try to understand and really have a connection to that reality before you can be any good at all, as versus being a hindrance to that person and the relationship that you might have. And so I think discomfort is a good thing. It signals to you that now it's your turn to accept that reality, even if we don't understand it, even if we disagree with it, sometimes maybe strongly. Everybody has their right to their reality. And as a result, we can work, several of the examples I really flashed through are in predominantly Muslim nations, for example, Senegal, Indonesia, and I have to go in and accept that reality to be any good. Otherwise, why am I there? What's my function? It's certainly not to argue or debate anything. It's to help. I loved your point of compassion. To have that relationship of compassion. That's what we are obligated to do.
I think discomfort is the right word. And it goes back to the point that I made at the start of my presentation, which is really the bravery of the people who are leading this conference. They're really pushing against the norms and expectations of what is normative today, of the modern architectural paradigm today, in which the sacred, the religious, the traditional is all viewed as backwards, and to turn to it is really taboo. So it's kind of like somebody, you've always been told not to go into a certain room or not to do something. You've been told it again and again and again and again. When you finally do it, of course, it's going to be this feeling of discomfort the first time you do it, or associated with it.
Let's see where the button is. Thank you. It's interesting that you raised the notion of discomfort, because I guess that's what I was feeling actually through the day, and I didn't know how to articulate it. But what's really interesting to me at the end of the day now, and I'm only beginning to sort of process what's gone on today, is the proximity of so much of the ways in which our different religions and backgrounds coalesce or overlap or intersect, and the problematic tensions that arise out of those intersections, be they similar or dissimilar from each other. But those connections through that discomfort, in other words. And I hadn't expected that to happen at all. In fact, coming into this, I thought to myself, oh dear, all right, we have a sort of the three primary, the triad, the triumvirate, might I say, of the religions represented. And what about all the others? I had mentioned to Ben and first discussing this, I mean, what about the Indigenous representation here? I mean, I think that's a huge chunk of what needed to be heard, although we did hear it a bit from you. But so what will happen in the intermix of these three great religions, if you will, today? And I was nervous about that. And yet now I find myself at once unnerved and at the same time looking forward to how I'm going to resolve the ways in which they intersect. So I'm grateful for the discomfort.
James, do you want to add anything on that, or can we go? Can I?
I think we can move on. Just because the first kind of impulse that came to my mind is not one of discomfort, but even various kinds of convergent and resonances that would have kind of perhaps had the other kind of sense of possibilities and kind of creative possibilities. And even was struck by how many of the presentations gave a sense of how so much, whether it's implicitly or um, um, at least partially, these ways of thinking and living and working are prevalent rather than so recessive as it might be initially perceived. So those are some initial thoughts.
I was struck by the word that kept coming back today, and I think 3 of the 4 of you, if not all of you, used it just now, was the word wisdom, and it came up also this morning, and somebody mentioned the contrast between the idea of wisdom and that of knowledge, that as you enter Harvard College yard, there's the gate, and it says, what is it? Enter here to grow in wisdom, right? And then there's questions: are you really learning wisdom, or is it knowledge? And what's the distinction between those things? But you all came back to wisdom as something that is valuable, as something that can be learned somehow. But James, I think if I heard you correctly, you spoke of our relationship to wisdom being at a very early stage relative to other things that we are able to speak about. If I didn't, I may be putting.
No, I was only speaking about my own institution of MIT,
Okay.
and relative to its mission statement, in which it's explicit and yet seemingly less developed than other aspects of pursuit of knowledge and so on. And say that there's again, if one looks empirically, you'd find examples of wisdom all throughout the institute. But if one looked for the kind of rigorous development of this capacity, then it's less fully developed than other aspects of teaching, learning, and work. So that was the thought that was on my mind. There are all kinds of ways in which I think this theme of wisdom would be a very great next step collectively, and all kinds of kind of challenges associated with it, because wisdom can often be conservative, very different from the prophetic, for example.
Yeah, I think I would not be being unfair to Harvard versus MIT, or any to say so that probably MIT is not the only institution that struggles to place wisdom within its current set of explicit ambitions. Which then brings me, I think this is my last question for all of you, which is, if we think now of what we have been talking about this afternoon and today within the context of a school of architecture and the school of design more generally, was there anything about your formation, your education, that prepared you to think more intelligently about any of what we have been discussing today? In other words, are there ways in which, as a school, a place like the GSD, or students could be pushing for a certain kind of intelligence to be brought to bear on the formation of the architect, if I could put it? Is that a clear question? Go ahead, Francis.
Yeah, I think it relates to your prior question too. I think for most of us who have practiced, and I speak for myself, I had to unlearn about as much as I thought I learned once in practice, because I didn't understand the difference between wisdom and knowledge. One of the things we got was a lot of knowledge, but that knowledge almost precluded are receiving wisdom, because that knowledge presumed a kind of clarity. You know, you go before a jury and you have to be very clear as to your intention, your concept, all that stuff. And that's totally artificial. You go before a community, you go through something like that, and they will see right through you. Because, you know, you come from another culture. Who are you to tell us what your construct is? And working with the Diné people, the Navajo, you have to go there. You have to eat with them. You have to be with them. You have to listen to them. You have to absorb their wisdom. We come with a certain amount of knowledge, and that's the reason we're there. But knowledge applied without wisdom is dangerous, I think. And I know that I really loved your closing comments about compassion. Another word that often is used in, I think, a lot of our traditions is love. I was told by, I believe, God, a long time ago, you cannot help or design for people that you don't love. So my first assignment is to seek to love people in a culture. And sometimes that's not easy because the culture is so different. But that's my first responsibility. That's something I never learned in school. I mean, what does love have to do with it? And yet in all of our religious traditions, yeah. You know, I pastor a Pentecostal church right on the edge of Chinatown. And when people agree with me, like I agreed with Rick so many times, I wanted to say amen, you know, because that's what people do in my church. But this is the thing. Isn't that true at Harvard, or I went to Cornell? You know, it's just this intense focus on architecture. You couldn't even go to your other classes. You had to be in studio. That's it, right? You give up everything to be an architect. And sometimes you give up this capacity to have compassion, to have love. And so that sort of has to get unlearned, I think. Not to say we don't walk away with a lot of knowledge, but without that love, what good is it?
Moving from knowledge towards wisdom, or information and knowledge towards wisdom, especially as we discuss religion and architecture, it's important for us to know that religion isn't just sentimentality, faith, and love. These are central and essential dimensions of religion, but it is more than just that. It is uh, it objectively has its own scientific traditions, its own epistemologies. I remember when I'm in the doctoral program at the Divinity School at Harvard, in the study of religion. At first, I was looking for a program in the history of science, and I couldn't find a single program that studied the history of science that predated the study science, any kind of science that predated Enlightenment and it predated the scientific revolution. And this idea, this absolutization of scientism, which does remarkable things for when it comes to empirical science, but to limit epistemology to only that way of knowing leads to a tremendous loss, to a loss of all the wisdom traditions of the world. And you have this happening from two different sides. One, scientism, you have which, if I were to discuss alchemy in addition to chemistry, I'd be kicked out of departments. Seen as like this guy, considered somebody who discusses superstition. So you have it from the scientific side, but then also from religious religious people too, who who embrace that and who forget their own sapiential traditions within Christianity. No one really speaks of a Christian epistemology today, really. It's usually Christian faith, it's Christian love, not a Christian epistemology. Um, the early church fathers, on the other hand, had so much to say, had so much to say, from Origen to Maximus the Confessor, um, everyone in between and beyond, or many people in between and beyond. Um, and I think we we lose a great deal in limiting religion to love, faith, and sentimentality.
Could you define epistemology for me? I'm not sure that I know what it means. I certainly don't know what it means in this context.
Ways of knowing, ways of knowing. So how do you perceive something? So how is a tree, what is a tree according to a high school textbook, to according to a middle school textbook? We learn that a tree is this organism, has all these different kinds of cells. It's used for paper products. It's used for all these different things. Rarely is a tree seen beyond its physicality. Rarely is a tree seen as a microcosm of the whole cosmos, as it would be in Sufi sciences, that see the whole world in the shape of a tree. Rarely an axis mundi, so to speak, the world tree, not just in Sufi sciences, but across the world in terms of traditions, or a symbol of immanence and transcendence, a symbol of the absolute, and the infinite, the absolute in its trunk and the infinite in its many branches, a sign of God, something that evokes the remembrance of God, or even, as I research in my doctoral program, something that is alive, that it's maybe easier to say for a tree. Stones and mountains, are they alive or are they not? They are inanimate according to one particular sign, one particular way of knowing. But you ask, but according to indigenous traditions, indigenous epistemologists know the mountain is alive. The mountain knows, the mountain thinks. And not only according to indigenous, but also according to Abrahamic sapiential traditions that don't get any of the light today.
Were you going to add something to that?
The question you had asked about, I guess, our formations, in a sense, because my own was a complete departure, and I am not an architect, and I did not have a strict architectural education the way you refer to it in the so-called great American schools. However, I was trained in France, and I had the benefit of a lot of French wonderful theoretical worlds, and my doctoral program was actually called, in translation, Theories and Histories of the Western World still, it's a long time ago, Histories and Theories of the Western World in Art and Culture. So this, broad, illustrious title assigned to a doctoral program, which in a sense really did represent the kind of vast variety of disciplines we had to study, even though it was considered art history per se, or architectural history. So it was a very different formation from what you're referring to.
Okay,
Maybe just
Kyle.
James quickly, and then Kala, is that all right?
Yes.
Just to wrap up this piece.
Just on this question of formation, I think there's a interesting tension, sometimes creative, sometimes just divergent in schools of design. Just as a point of contrast, the first studio that we had at Louisiana State University, they said, okay, you all are coming to the Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana, which is an infamous one, and you're going to redesign a cell block and talk to prisoners about this place and about their life there, and just, some students, these were 18, 19 years old, had kind of had a form of immersion. The ideas were terrible in the studio. They were, but the everyone came away with an idea that we're in an important field. I think that was, and then I think there's a creative tension with that and more disciplinary types of approaches that are, formal geometries and technologies of design that enable one to address problems. But you either have a problem-driven approach right from the get-go, or a discipline-based one that arrives with a hope for capability to address such pressing problems. And those two approaches to design curricula seem not yet to be reconciled or kind of sorted out in the field.
Yes, well, thank you, all of you. But speaking of discomfort, the way that this day has gone has made me rather uncomfortable, because I'm very curious whether the purpose, the role of a school of architecture is actually to teach compassion. It seems to me that we've heard a lot about humility, the submission of the will, compassion. But is that really what you go to the Graduate School of Design to do? I mean, do you really need this school in order to teach those things?
I think that's a fundamental question. And I'd say the answer is yes, you do. And that it's not just for architecture, but for any and all fields. If you don't have some kind of very strong sense of the philosophy for the purpose of the discipline and its aims and ends, then it's more of a technical type of study, whatever the field, humanities, social sciences, physical sciences. That's just a personal view.
So this is why I was raising the issue of Moneo's idea of the risk that an architect must take, that you can't somehow sit back and feel good and listen. I mean, at some point you have to be very active and shape the discussion.
And the risks that you point to are very, very real. The question that came up earlier, have you ever been associated with a project that you were ambivalent about or troubled by? And all of us who've been in practice, I think I can speak of projects that every day I was asking myself, do I want to be associated with this project? Do I have an idea, trying out an idea that was risky, that said, oh, you want to be fired? This is a bad, so you have this, I think you touched on an extremely important dimension of this field of study, and it's part of it. It's right at the heart of it.
Can I respond to that too, Carla? I think that it is important, because this point about, okay, now you've made it to Harvard. Now what do you, how do you proceed? When you come to an institution like this and graduate, people give you a lot of credibility. You have this good housekeeping seal of approval. If you are taught compassion, which I believe you need to, and in fact, in practice, our good housekeeping seal of approval of our firm, G70, on a project means a lot to that project. It means things to bankers, it means things to the community, in public meetings and things like this. So every week, we have somebody come from a social service agency and speak to our group. Every week, we have people coming in, because we're trying to teach in practice this idea of compassion. What are we all about? With that kind of training, you could be sent out to the Navajo Nation, for example, for a semester to live there, to develop this compassion and understanding. You would come back and be a real source of good for society. Without that, whether you will be good for society or not is a question. You might be good technical architects, you might be good design, form and space type architects. But really, will you help society develop in a positive way? And our biggest problem today is not that we don't have enough beautiful buildings. We don't. But we have a society that's going over the cliff. It's not going to be measured in how many beautiful buildings we have when it goes over the cliff. We have people literally starving out there, homeless out there, needing housing, just very basic housing, needing education, needing a path to some kind of normal life. architects actually can make a huge difference in all of that. This is what we aspire to do.
Madrasa in Marrakesh, where each student, this is historic now, each student had a room, and each of the rooms was furnished very differently. And we, Maureen and I, wondered about this. We asked somebody, an expert there, and he said, oh yes, they set up the students, each student in his or her, I don't know whether hers there, but his room, as a reflection of the home environment in which that student grew up. So instead of this wrench from home to a university, and I'm talking about the beginning of the university, not graduate school, that's another story, but that wrench from home to the institution is replaced in this madrasa, or used to be, by a recreation of the comfort, the physical comfort, so the mental discomfort could thrive within it and one could grow. Which brings me to the question of the difference between undergraduate school and graduate school. University in Ireland, where I grew up, was a different place from a teaching school as such. You were considered an adult and you were responsible for yourself and your questioning of the institution. But there was training, of course, there had to be the skills. But at graduate school in America, certainly under with Lou Kahn and Jurgala and Sachanovsky and all these people, you were considered an inquiring mind. And if you weren't an inquiring mind, well, what are you doing here? It was just a small question.
Could we make an appeal for student comments, questions? If there's anything out there that has been bothering somebody, or go ahead.
I'm close to a student. I guess this is like a comment and maybe it evolves into a question, but I like, Kyle, you always like unpack all these levels of what's going on, but the idea of discomfort was interesting because that was coming to mind every time somebody spoke in this, especially in this last panel. And I thought it was particularly interesting because I felt the duality within myself as an architecture student, like just coming right to the surface, even though I spoke about it in the morning. The deep sense of, well, this isn't, I think what Carla is saying, like Walter Gropius certainly didn't think this had a place like at the institution because like the Bauhaus was like dual in that nature and that was pursuing spirituality. But I thought what was interesting is that each one of you guys were talking about the mechanics of I hear from God, or these are the values in the Quran, or the value of space in the paradox of God's temporality and where he dwells with his people. And I don't know, I wonder if you guys sense this too, but it's so rare to hear people be very detailed and specific about their personal journeys relative to their disciplinary practices, because I think it does express itself very differently. And too often we're forced to convert that into this like homogenous, palatable, spiel for the academy. So I don't know if you felt like this was like a very different type of academic discourse, because it's no less rigorous, but it is very personal, and that strikes me as like, well, this feels weird. And I don't know if you could speak to that too, having teaching in architectural institutions and seeing how that happens.
I'm inclined to think we have to learn also how to disagree with one another on things, that actually we have to learn to argue. And I think when it comes to religion, we're very bad at that, because we equate, because we think of religion as this personal thing that is part of your identity, and I can't question it because it is part of who you are, and therefore it becomes impossible to really argue about something. And I think we probably have to argue. Like there are all kinds of arguments that I would love to jump into. If we could, like, for example, with Francis, what if you don't like what God tells you to the design, right? Or what if there are two people on that competition who both have the same, like what happens then, right? And I think one could have actually a really interesting conversation about that. And it could, I hope, be a rigorous and intellectually sophisticated and fully involved, but also respectful conversation. But we have to practice those conversations in order to even begin to go there. And I think on the whole, we don't.
Can I sort of address what you're talking about, just to answer that question? What I found is that, I mean, much to my surprise, you know, these designs that God gives me are more individual. But then you work it out with a team. You have to have a team to work it out. But I'll give you one example. We were in a competition for a project in Tahiti, not the one I showed. And there were so many buildings, we had to do them in 3 days per building. And there are some 27 buildings, redo of all of the capital of Papeete. So we had a team of 3 French architects in the office, and then we supplied 3 people from G70. One day we had to do a design. The next day, get it into the computer. The third day, into our presentation. We just had to keep going like that. So one day we were doing the legislature, the building, but I was delayed. I could not get there on time. So I had 20 minutes, okay? So I sat with the team and I prayed. And I start to relate this vision of a building that none of us have ever seen before, the likes of which. And then I get stopped by one of the French architects and says, "Francis, this is irresponsible. You know, we're trained to do analysis and to go through this process and all of that." I said, "You know, I understand what you're saying. We went through the same training, but how long would that take? 2 to 3 months." I said, "We got 2 to 3 days. And anyway, now I only have 10 minutes. And so I related what I was seeing. So later on in the afternoon, I come back to the office. Now they've kind of worked it out. I said, "How did it go?" And they said, "Wonderful, it all works." So that night, they were staying in a condominium throughout this competition period in Waikiki, and they always ate together. And our partner from Tahiti was there with them. And this French architect asked him, "How did Francis do that?" And our partner, who's a Christian, said, "It's not Francis, it's God." And the guy paused for a moment. He said, "Yeah, really, how did he do that?" So obviously, you know, having experienced it, he still couldn't accept that reality. And yet it worked. And so what I would say is not so much whether we agree or not, is the result there? We won the competition. Are the results there? That's the question, not whether you can argue overcome somebody else's arguments and win the argument. I have no interest in arguing with people or debating things. It either works or it doesn't work. That's it. I don't care whose idea it is. But the one great thing is if it's not your idea, you are not burdened with success, because success can be a burden, or failure. It's not your idea, you know. It gives you tremendous freedom as a designer, great freedom. That's how I respond.
Any other, one last question, comment? Go ahead.
Probably not. Oh, great. So great. This has been an incredible conference. I wasn't here for the morning section, but I've never seen something like this done in the States in general, particularly in architecture environment. But maybe to respond to about the inquiring of our minds and stuff, I would almost say people here inquire just as much, if not maybe more than they did in the past. But there is certainly like a line of inquiry you're meant to follow. We're being taught currently you can only inquire if you inquire in this way. And I think what this conference brings up is that we all come from very different diverse backgrounds that influence how we design, and they influence the type of inquiries we do. And what's been great is to see how you guys have taken your personal beliefs and how you put that into your inquiries and allowed them to shape what you do in a positive way that benefits the world. And it'd be great to see more of that done just in general, the architecture world.
It'd be one thing that'd be interesting if the organizers would be designers in the way that you take the presentations that you've heard, put them together in some creative way. And I'm just taking from our own panel. I heard these ideas about the heart. I say, okay, I'm going to be taking on this, and then with Munjed on the other creatures and dimensions of that aspect of environmental design, and Francis on another way, Kyle. And so as a designer, you'd start to put together these ideas in some new fashion. And if you were to think of some synthesis that you might be able to produce, that might be miraculous to do that. But if you could do it, I think it would be a good kind of challenge for you as designers to think in that mode.
I was going to say that thank you for your comments. I appreciate it, because what it tells me is that you all need to be empowered, essentially, into designing your own futures within the school and post-school, obviously. But while you're here, how complicated that must be, how difficult it must be to fight the hierarchy in that sense, right? And in terms of the pedagogy. And I can only hope that this will provide some enablement. But it distresses me that many of the faculty who teach here are not present. And it once again inculcates the kind of stuff we've been hearing about. And I'm sure it's not, as we've heard, it's not exclusive to this particular school. And it certainly exists in Canada as well. I'm not going to say no, but it's a function of the type of educational system of the architect, if you will, in North America at least. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but I would say that the bravery that you've referred to, that this is truly a brave step in the future to a future situation where that enablement might begin to occur. But it's going to take a long, long time, and you'll be graduated way before that.
Thank you, Shelley. That might be a good note on which to stop.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you all very much.
We're gonna hear, so panelists can take seats. We have some closing remarks, but if you guys want to take seats quickly. So just before our closing remarks, we just need to repeat our thank yous, especially to our committee, Caroline, Hannah, Nabila, Sydney, and Ethan. And also thank you to our advisors, Jeff and Rabbi Getzel. And thank you also to Erica in the Student Services Office.
And we should also thank our sponsors for today's conference, Christian Union, the GSD Dean's Office, Mohsen Mustafavi, GSD Student Services, and Laura Snowden, Harvard Hillel Graduate Community, and InterVarsity as well. Without them, this conference would not have happened. And thank you to all our panelists.
Okay, some last logistics of the day. After our closing remarks, we hope that everyone will stay for happy hour. We've organized to have our own internal happy hour for the conference. And then that will lead right into the school-wide famous GSD Beer and Dogs, which is our weekly happy hour. And our hope that the conversations that we've begun today will continue far and wide, and that we can enhance the network through the happy hour, through the Beer and Dogs, and if you're joining us for dinner as well. Hope that we can enhance this network and become stronger together moving forward. So if you are going to join us for the dinner, we just ask that you meet us in the lobby at about 7:15 so we can walk over.
But first, our final speaker for the day will be Cristina Gonzalez-Ho. She is a worship leader, musician, and writer. She's an attorney and graduated from Harvard Law School before working on a book in the art cultural landscape of LA with her husband, Christian. Please welcome Cristina.
Thank you. Congratulations, you guys. You did it. This was awesome. Yeah, another round of applause for you. Very, very, very proud of you guys. And everybody else. I know a lot of people worked on putting this conference together, and you all did an amazing job. And speakers, you are all incredible, and I'm so honored to have heard from you and learned from you. I thought that I would be bored because I'm not interested in design or architecture, but I was just fascinated the whole time. So thank you guys. So yeah, my name is Cristina. I graduated from HLS in 2014. I'm married to Christian. And the only architecture that I can fairly be said to practice is the architecture of words through writing. So I'm going to read you guys a poem. And this is from a book, not a poem of mine. This is from a book by Christian Wyman. Incidentally, he teaches at Yale Divinity School. And the poem is by someone named A.R. Ammons. And Christian Wyman writes this about Ammons. Ammons had little patience with institutional religion and could be particularly caustic about Christianity, the religion of his childhood. His poems record an intense but indeterminate devotion, and they are the testaments of a man who wouldn't believe in anything at all beyond the material world were it not for the insights he has been given in his own life and poetry. In a 1955 letter to his friend, the poet Josephine Miles, Ammons writes, "I am a mystic, but by memory only. For an instant, about 10 years ago, I felt the perspective from space to earth. Sick as I may have been, I was there. By the use of the intelligence, of course, you can work up such perspectives at will, but it's a very different thing from being there. In the mixture of joy and of a sort of mad sorrow at the lot of man. What I seemed to see has remained literally the weight of the world. All the good realists, materialists, and rationalists I have been able to get my hands on have done nothing to that experience. Perhaps only an equally powerful experience, certainly stronger than intellectual conviction in another direction, can ever move me." So this is the poem, and I don't have a slide, so I suggest, you don't have to do this, but I suggest that you just close your eyes, listen carefully, and I'm going to try to read this slowly and well. The poem is called "The City Limits." When you consider the radiance, that it does not withhold itself, but pours its abundance without selection into every nook and cranny not overhung or hidden. When you consider that birds' bones make no awful noise against the light, but lie low in the light as in a high testimony. When you consider the radiance, that it will look into the guiltiest swervings of the weaving heart and bear itself upon them, not flinching into disguise or darkening. When you consider the abundance of such resource as illuminates the glow blue bodies and gold skeined wings of flies swarming the dumped guts of a natural slaughter or the coil of shit, and in no way winces from its storms of generosity. When you consider that air or vacuum, snow or shale, squid or wolf, rose or lichen, each is accepted into as much light as it will take. Then the heart moves roomier. The man stands and looks about. The leaf does not increase itself above the grass, and the dark work of the deepest cells is of a tune with May bushes, and fear, lit by the breadth of such, calmly turns to praise. Faith in Design. I love that title for this conference because it's so slippery and it's so hard to define. And why have a whole conference about this word, faith? I think Barbara, one of the moderator for the first panel, had asked the question, why not call it religion and design? In the art and architecture world, as we've talked about all day, and in most of academia, people tend to disdain talk about faith. It's just too fluffy. It's too mushy. It's not rigorous. We can talk about religion. I know those words have been used interchangeably today. I'm using them as two different but overlapping things. We talk about religion. It can be controversial. It can be uncomfortable to talk about it, but at least we have some language to discuss it, right? We can discuss it as a cultural or historical phenomenon. We can study it. We can criticize it. We can debate and write essays about it. But faith, what some people call spirituality, as the artist Lita Albuquerque, whom Christian referenced today, said to us in an interview, you can't talk about that in art school because it's not in the canon. And she's talking, of course, about the Western canon, right? That like as a student in art and architecture or law, right? You learn, you have this canon, you have these earlier precedents and writings, and you study them, and then you respond to them. And as you do works of your own, you kind of like get more points for, the number of allusions you made to the canon or how thoughtfully or cleverly you responded to it. But that canon hasn't really given us any space to engage with faith. And by that, I mean with the experience of the supernatural, the spiritual, the divine, or with like the lack of experience with those things. There's like barely any language in the Western canon for these things, right? Instead, we're taught to put things into manageable boxes so that we can name them and number them and parse them. And in doing so, we do learn a lot of other things. I'm not downing that at all. I think it has its place. But in only focusing on that, of course, we lose the ability to engage with faith and to really, truly engage with the subject of faith is to be so vulnerable, scarily vulnerable. It's to admit that we have hope and desire for things that are unseen. It's to admit that we feel confusion and disappointment and pain when that hope is deferred or when it's betrayed or even crushed. When we try to engage with the unseen or the divine, and all we are met with is darkness. It's to risk looking like a fool in places like the GSD. But without engaging with it, you lose the wonder, you lose the joy, you lose, as our panelists discussed right before this, the wisdom of faith, this wisdom that you just can't access by only confining yourself to the Western canon. Sorry. And even in places of work, thank you. Even in places of worship, even in, I grew up in going to all kinds of different churches, and even in church, it can be really difficult to really talk about faith, as opposed to talking about, religion or certain rituals. You can talk about religion for days and actually not talk about faith or spirituality. And I think, even a religious adherents get stuck in that Western way of dealing with encountering the divine or the pain that you feel when you haven't or you can't access it, right? But you want to. That Western box is really, I think, a way of fleeing from the darkness and the mystery of God, from that which is outside of our control and outside of our understanding. And yet the very things that we are trying to escape are the things that haunt us our whole lives, whether we admit it or not, right? It's those questions that like people allow themselves to maybe discuss in college at 3 a.m. or when they're really drunk, you know, like, where does life come from? Does my life have meaning? Why am I here? What happens to me after I die? You know, those questions. And Kyle mentioned that we need to learn how to disagree with each other. And, you know, maybe we need to have some arguments. But how do you disagree with somebody's faith? You know, like, how do you disagree with somebody's belief system in that which is unseen? Without having like some sort of a canon, right? I think that's why we retreat into that. We're like, well, we have to have like some ground rules of like how we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about. And I think, I don't think you can have those arguments and those deeper discussions without ultimately getting to those ultimate questions. You know, that is, you can't remain objective and neutral and above the fray and without emotion, you know, everything that we prize in academia. You can't have that and have like real discussions about faith, especially with people that you disagree with. So all of that to say, I am very, very grateful to our speakers today for modeling that vulnerability here. And not just here, but you guys have been doing it for years, some of you for decades. And it really shows. I'm so grateful for you bringing that, for you bringing your whole selves today, selves that usually don't get to be displayed in places like the GSD. You've really paved a way for us. And I think I'm just excited, you know, what is next year's conference going to look like? I think we're going to be able to, you know, go even deeper. This is just a launching pad. And, you know, may we go forth even in our own lives. It doesn't have to just be confined to a conference, right? The point of this is that we can hopefully be inspired and encouraged to go forth, following the lead of all the speakers today, and continue to ask those deep questions of ourselves, of each other, with more courage, with more honesty, with more humility, and of course, with grace. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, but that is it. Good. But it is difficult to get the story clear because, for example, people don't realize that over 50 years, 1950, there was a conference that came out from the army. Oliver and I and some of the jumped off the Wescoat, as they call it here. And these papers were expected for us. And all these things get to decide the basic side. So the one and you know, when you forget the sequence, I think it must be that this is a match. I don't think I don't think that.